Bigger than capes.
Give me some outside.
I was looking forward to it, and then I watched it.
Oh, dry.
Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Capes. I'm Angela, and this week I am joined by the writer of Infidel and The Good Asian, Pornsak Pichetshote. Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. It's still an interesting time here in Los Angeles where some people are leaving the houses, some people aren't as much. I'm in the not as much sort of category, but we'll see what September brings.
Fingers crossed September will be
Fingers
better. Yeah, in the UK we're sort of it's a weird most people seem to have forgotten, but we'll see.
But it feels like last I checked, your numbers were going down now. Is that right, or is that old information?
Yeah, they're going up, but we're not got quite as many people dying in hospital as we did because the vaccine effect has kicked in a little bit.
Got it.
Fingers crossed, it won't be too bad a winter.
Okay,
we shall see. But when is, which is what we're here to talk about, when is the Trade of the Good Asian out? Because that's
not far at all. The Trade of the Good Asian comes out September 22nd in comic book stores and September 28th in bookstores.
Excellent. So, and it's the first 4 issues, am I right?
First 4 issues, yep.
Which I found weird, because is it going to be a 10-issue complete story? Which made me hang on a second. So logically, I'd just split it into 5 and 5, but here we have 4.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why is that we wanted a little bit was based on sort of the, it was interesting. I think originally, when I developed the book, we didn't really know how relevant it was going to be, sort of current events and all that sort of stuff. And it's when the book launched. And so when the book launched, because it was so relevant, the decision was let's get it out sooner as opposed to later. And issue 4 was because originally our very, very first sort of conversation was let's just do all 10 issues and put them out as sort of one big massive trade. And then the response of the book and sort of what it was talking about was so well received, so timely. It felt like, well, let's not wait till like next year where who knows if these issues were still going to be talked about as much. And let's get sort of people on the ground floor now. And in which case 1 to 4 made a great package to sort of do that. Because from issue 5 on, and issue 5 comes out the very next week in comic book stores on September 29th, we're pretty much even though we're still 6 issues away, there's pretty much a straight rocket as we go through things. And so that's why we decided it's first 4, then 6.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I have to say as well, in terms of the story, and I'm going to probably, for anyone who's not read it, I apologize, I'm probably going to mention spoilers. So keep that. I'm going to be trying to be as spoiler-free as possible, but something may creep in there. But yeah, because the end of issue 4 was quite shocking. So it kind of does make sense to sort of have a trade that ends on that event.
Yeah. I don't want to spoil anything, but I hope people think the end of issue 5 is just as, and not, if not more so shocking. And so when you read the end of issue 5, you'll realize why we didn't want, for trade readers specifically, we didn't want to leave like 6 to 7 to 8 months between sort of the cliffhangers.
Well, now I'm intrigued. Now I'm intrigued. So let's go back. The first book of yours that I've read, Infidel, came out, I think it's probably longer ago than I thought. I tend to think things came out last year, and then someone corrects me and says, actually, that was like 3 years ago. I'm like, was it?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much at this point in my whole life, everything seems to have happened last year, and I have to be told, like, oh no, apparently it did not. Either happened last year or like 20 years ago, and like there's no in between for me. Sort of like,
no.
Yeah.
No. So that's obviously a different book in some ways because it's got a very strong horror element to it.
Yes.
It's very much a horror book. But at the same time, there are certain themes that sort of are very similar in terms of race and immigration and that sort of thing. So at what point did the Good Asian come into being? What was the genesis behind that one?
That's so interestingly enough, the Good Asian came to being even before the idea for it came to being even before I started writing Infidel. I mean, the idea for Infidel came back in 2009, and it was something I was sitting on for a while. The idea for the Good Asian came before Infidel, but it was one of those things that I just kind of like worked on in the background and researched in the background. And for me, what had happened was I had just learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I was looking into sort of the Chinese part. I self-identify as Thai American, but I'm actually Chinese on my father's side, and it was a part of my heritage that I never really looked into sort of very much. And so I started looking into it more, and I guess because I am so, my center of gravity tends to shift towards Americana, tends to shift to American pop culture, that when I was reading about Chinese history, I found myself drawn to the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act of 1924, and sort of realized like, wow, I hadn't realized that there were immigration bans towards Asians coming into the country for, a good portion of its history. And again, because my interests tend to veer towards pop culture, it was fascinating to me because I remember that in the 1930s, characters like Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto, Mr. Wong Detective were very popular. And it was fascinating to me that these Asian characters were so popular when Asians themselves weren't allowed into the country. And so that's where I had the start of the idea of, doing one of those, using that archetype of the Asian crime solver, but using sort of the racial lens of today to sort of examine it and to examine what we know about immigration and immigrant communities and the police, to sort of, to take a new look at that genre and align it more closely with noir, which I felt, made perhaps a better genre fit than sort of the almost Agatha Christie type, mysteries that they, that Hercule Poirot sort of mysteries that they had at the time. Yeah.
I think it's surprising because I remember reading that first issue and going, actually, this could almost be now in terms of the themes in here with the police and the immigrant community, and poor Edison sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. And it's amazing, it's like how little we've come in nearly 100 years.
It's really true. It's really true. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted sort of specific time, in the 1930s leading up to sort of World War II, like so much of it, there were so many parallels to what we're going through now, and there were so many parallels in the 30s in terms of what we're going through now. So, all that stuff seemed to align really well. So it checked a bunch of boxes simultaneously.
Yeah, it definitely, it does. And I think it benefits from being in that period as well, because, noir does sort of, like you say, Agatha Christie, if you had him wandering around like Hercule Poirot, it probably wouldn't have the same effect.
Right.
Whereas setting it in that period where it's a dark period of, corrupt cops and all the rest of it just after Prohibition is a bit more streets, sort of, on the streets, that kind of thing. It makes it feel more realistic in a weird way.
It's a little grittier, that I think if you look, and I'm not a history of noir and the crime genre as much as my editor is, but I think he will sort of say that like noir, the introduction of noir was sort of a re-examining and a repositioning of sort of the Agatha Christie sort of type novels and trying to make, give a more ground level, relatable sort of detective character than certainly what Agatha Christie had sort of pioneered with Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot and all those great characters.
Yeah, because I think as well with those, they're very English to a certain degree. It's very... There's class stuff that goes on, and noir tends to be more. I always associate, even though it's sort of French in origin, I always associate it more with America for some reason.
Totally true. It's a good question. I feel the same way. Like I feel it is a very like the noir detective specifically feels
Yeah.
like such an American, American archetype. Probably because it feels like I actually don't know sort of what the first European noir detective is, but certainly Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, are such archetypes for noir and their American characters.
Yeah. Did you read much of? You mentioned Charlie Chan. Obviously, you're very familiar with those guys. Were you also familiar with sort of the noir with Philip Marlowe and Sam Spade, those kind of guys?
Yeah, I mean, part of like, I think it's part of the reason why I like working on what I work on is that sometimes it just becomes excuses to like reread stuff you like, or read stuff you always said you wanted to read but you're never going to. So like, part of working on this book, I got to read all the Philip Marlowe stuff. I read Sam Spade stuff. I read a lot of Continental Op, which is also a big influence on this. Some Lou Archer mysteries, and Easy Rawlins, and there was a bunch. So it borrows from a lot of sort of like pulp detectives.
It does feel like there's been a lot of research gone in, because you even have a historical consultant.
Yeah,
which
we do.
You don't get many comics with historical consultants. How on earth do you find a historical consultant for this sort of thing?
It's funny. So for me, the thing about the subject matter, like if you're looking at 1930s Chinatown and what the shadow of the Immigration Act affected their daily lives, there's like not much, barely little written about it. So you kind of have to triangulate between a bunch of different texts and a bunch of different sources. And because I felt I was really out over my skis, I don't think I could have had the confidence. I knew I wouldn't have the confidence to write it unless I had someone, for all intents and purposes, checking my math to make sure I didn't go wrong. And so early on in this process, as I was thinking about it, I was trying to rack through my Rolodex of friends in terms of like who might, be able to point me in the right direction. And my friend Dawn Lee Tu, who's a professor herself, she deals a lot with sort of Asian American studies. So I sort of, gave her a call. I think I actually I think I probably visited her the same time I took my very first research trip to Angel Island. And we got dinner, and she was just like, oh, I can think of some people, because she's sort of in that academic community. She was able to bring me to Grant Din, who has been fantastic and essential to the book. And so he provided me, he became that sort of last line of defense, so that I could make the book with the confidence that it needed to sort of be done with.
Because I really like the fact that you have in the back of each issue, you go through the history of the Chinese community and all the immigration stuff, because literally all I knew was, well, there were Chinese immigrants in San Francisco. That was my level. And to see all this extra bit, it's been very eye-opening, because I had no idea that at one point, because America was land of the immigrants, and at one point they were actually stopping Chinese immigration, was something I had no idea happened.
I'm glad it was educational. Like, it's funny because to me, all of this and all this stuff with the Good Age and all the stuff I do is very much an extension of comics, an extension of genre. So like, I'm just a person who I've learned so much from comics. And so a lot of the back matter to me is, the extension of what, Ed Brubaker does sort of in his books, but it's also, what Alan Moore did at the end of From Hell, but really goes all the way back to like, old 60s, where you have like Flash comics and there were Flash facts at the end, and you learn a little bit of science from all those. So like, I've always sort of like, probably embarrassingly have learned a lot about the world from comics. And so I just thought, oh, well, let's just do a more adult version of that. Let's do a more specific version of that.
It works really well. I like being able to learn things from comics.
It's all I do. It's all I do. So,
and I think it's a lot easier to sort of have something rather than just here's a textbook or here's a web page that has all this information. It's just a more dynamic way of imparting that information to someone.
I hope so. Like, for me, like, it is something that I do get out of the reading experience when I have a comic. Like my concern is I never want the reader to feel like I'm feeding them vegetables, but like I do hope it's done in the spirit of fun of the like I do want it to be fun. So so that is, you know, I want it to be informative, but I want it to inform in a fun way. So even if like you're one of those readers is like, too many words, I don't want to deal with, like, it hopefully is set, like you can hopefully appreciate the comics and the story separate from all that. But then if you are very invested in the story, you can get into all that, and hopefully that is its own sort of sense of fun, depending on your tastes.
That's definitely my sense of fun. So I'm that kind of a reader. Because one thing that did surprise me was, I mean, even though it is quite bleak at points and there's murders and it's quite noir, I think there is some sort of humor in there. It's from the way sort of we've got Edison's narration, and yeah, there's still humor in it.
I'm glad. You never know how much of that stuff lands. So, but yeah, I think there is, like, I think Edison is so jaded, and you know that there is a little bit of a deadpanness that kind of runs through it that pops up occur occasionally.
Yeah, I think he's a really interesting protagonist. How much of yourself do you see in Edison? There's a question.
There's a lot. I mean, I feel like, you know, when you're writing, your characters are different versions. You know, they refract different versions of you, no matter what. So there's a lot of me that goes into Edison. You know, I maybe would say Edison is me on a bad day, maybe. Edison on a day when I'm not feeling my oats. Yeah, I think, you know, but there's a lot of, you know, his frustrations. It's interesting what your characters teach you and what your characters can teach you about yourself. Edison is such an angry character, but he keeps his anger sort of you know, under control. He became a good way to exercise a lot of my anger that I don't think I realized I had. And so when I'm writing Edison, it's constantly an education of like, oh, I'm a lot angrier than I thought I was. And so it's been good to have that, and it's good to be able and just have that as an outlet.
Yeah, just a bit of therapy, just right there. Because it must be, because it is very much first person. He's there most of the time, and we see things from most of his point of view. So you must be in his head more than you might be if you were writing from a third person point of view.
Yeah, definitely. And it is funny now that you mention that, because having I've just recently finished writing sort of the whole book, and the book is one that gets easier and easier to write, primarily because I think you are launched into such a dark world sort of in the beginning. And so you know, when you are surrounded by all those facts and how little the world has changed and all that sort of stuff, like it can be kind of depressing, and it can kind of bring you down. And again, the work, I hope, is to just sort of keep that fun, you know, in the spirit of noir, keep it fun. But the thing I actually do enjoy is, as the book progresses, it gets easier to write, because I'm not going to say the story gets more hopeful, but the more Edison sees the world, the more Edison starts to change, the more Edison starts to react to the world. He, you know, the only place for him to go is to see things that he didn't see before. And that is exciting. And that, you know, I think part of where Edison starts in the beginning of the story is seeing that there are no options in the world. And as he goes, he sees options. They might not be the best options. They might not be, you know, they almost always come at a price, but walking him as he sees options has made the book an easier place for me to sort of write it from.
Yeah, so it's less of the hopeless nurse, but it's not exactly hopeful, because that would imply good options that are very positive outcomes, but it's not as hopelessness. It's not as hopeless as it first seemed.
Yeah. And I think, to me, that's the appeal of noir, right? It's like these dark worlds, but like these detectives are these white knights, but because it's such a dark world, though, you know, they can't be that white, you know, they can't be that pure. And so one of the things you get is, whether it's Philip Marlowe, who, despite how bad everything gets, he wants to know the truth. And there's something noble in this character who just wants to know the truth, no matter how bad sort of everything gets, and no matter what the costs will be. And I think Edison is of that mold of, no matter how dark the world is, the fact that he's still going despite all of it and he doesn't give up is, and he realizes in the course of the story why that is I think part of where the hopefulness of the book comes from. And hopefully the appeal, the romantic heroism that's kind of also part of noir.
Yeah, because it's these guys with a strong moral fiber, even though that fiber does get dragged through the mud. Right.
Yeah.
So thinking about a dark world, let's talk about the art, because the art really helps set the whole tone. So did you get a choice of artist, or was it like, we'll find you an artist, or how did you find?
I mean, we definitely had a choice. We definitely searched long and hard and wide for Alex. Alex Tefenji is the artist on the book. For anyone who doesn't know, he's amazing. Said his name,
but I wasn't sure how to pronounce his surname. I'll be
totally
honest.
Good.
That's why I
totally
didn't
good.
say it.
Totally good. And so, I mean, we will search long and hard for Alex. I wanted an Asian artist primarily because, there were so many details that you'll see in sort of Asian households and that are different from sort of Western households that I just didn't want to micromanage. So it was just easier. I was hoping for someone with a similar background to me, in the sense of they've been around enough Eastern households that they didn't need Eastern/Western households that they didn't need me to be like there, be like, actually it's like this, or actually it's like that. And also too, like, and I also wanted someone, I feel like you get a lot of artists who work in that mold, but they are influenced less by the real world and more by manga or anime or stuff like that, which is fine. But I didn't want it to be sort of like a pastiche of something else. So so it was great. We looked forever. So, it was it's actually really gratifying. So many artists that we first looked at, they weren't available. I think I want to say like 10 years ago in the dark ages when I was editing comics, there were Asian artists who might be slightly manga influenced. They had a hard time sort of finding work, and it feels like now that is no longer the case. Like, they were all sort of booked up, and thank God they were, because Alex, for so many reasons, was just like the perfect person to draw this book, but we didn't know who he was, and he wasn't available before the time where we knew who he was, because he was drawing a book called Outpost Zero. And the thing that was fantastic about Alex has got such a fascinating story where, he's in his late 30s, early 40s, and I think in his mid 30s, he had grown up thinking he was I'm trying to remember. He was part African. God, now of course I'm blanking. I think he thought he was like part Lebanese. I don't quote me on that. But basically, in his mid 30s, his mother kind of told him like, "Oh, you're adopted, and your father is Asian." And so in his mid 30s, he found out he was Asian, and then all these things in his life kind of made sense. And he was already traveling around the world, with his wife. And so him and his wife had always thought about moving to Southeast Asia. But when he found out he was, Asian, Vietnamese specifically, he was just like, well, Vietnam makes the best sense. And so they ended up living in Vietnam so he can get a little closer to his roots and learn more about it. So when, as he was finishing up Outpost Zero, he met with his friend Cliff Chang, who's a mutual friend of ours. And, me and my editor, Will Dennis, were talking to Cliff about looking for an artist and if he knew anybody. And Cliff was like, yeah, I'll keep my eyes out. And so Cliff was talking to Alex at this party at New York Comic Con. And I think it was like the last New York Comic Con. Well, no, there's a New York Comic Con like coming up, but like the last New York Comic Con before the world shut down. And Alex was telling a story about how he's living in Vietnam. He's trying to figure out what being Asian means to him, because it's such a new thing in his life. And Cliff was just like, oh my God, I had the perfect book for you. And introduced into us, and ever since it's like, oh, there's all this like synchronicitous timing. And that's kind of like the amazing thing I find about comics, is there's these, I think so many creative teams I know have certain stories about how, like, these people that you would never think you have a connection to, you end up having this mystical connection to. I remember when I met Aaron Campbell, you know, for Infidel, that was sort of my first book. It wasn't totally catch as catch can, but like there were so many things that the art needed to be that for a while it's just like, does this artist even exist? Like, I don't even know if the artist exists who can draw the things I need for him to draw. And Aaron came around and could do all those things. And then when we talked to each other, we had like the exact same sense of horror and what our tastes were and what our influence were. And that was just kind of amazing, because I'd never met him and never knew him before that.
I love how life throws up those weird connections and things just all slot into place, because the art just works, and clearly Alex himself has the background that fits perfectly with the book as well. I mean, it does become this thing that I wonder that, because everything we do is an extension of ourselves, that like finding the right creative team ends up finding the right people. If they're going to reflect something that you worked on so passionately, it makes sense that there's something personal to them that reflects a part of you as well. So, but yeah, it's a magical experience. It is. Yeah. It's so weird, but so good at the same time. Because I think that's really good about the art, because it just completely fits, and it seems like there's a lot of details in there that I'm never gonna get into a certain degree. Culturally, it's just gonna go over my head, but it just works, and I'm sure that Asian readers will appreciate having those little details in there.
It's been great to it's been great to sort of see the people sort of pick up on it, and we get like so micromanagey on little things. I remember this one time, and Will, our editor, was just like, I could feel him shaking his head through the computer as he was doing it. But I remember this. I think it was one issue. We realized that like, the characters, and it's such a tiny thing. It's the tiniest little thing of all. But we realized that there was an issue where the characters didn't take their shoes off when they walked into, and so they had their shoes on in the rooms, and we're like, they wouldn't do that. And so it's literally just an alteration of a line. It literally is just that. But we're like, we should change that. But it's not like there are any panels, because it's not an important detail. There's no panels in the issue of them taking off their shoes. So it literally is just showing that like, they're not shoes, that they're socks, and just changing all the feet. The silhouette of the feet in that way, but it was one of those things like, we got to change that. And meanwhile, it's you're gonna go through the entire issue and just like do this, like draw a straight line, draw an angular line over these tiny feet. But he's just like, do what you're gonna do. Like, I get it. And so he's good about that stuff.
It's the little details that show you care, though, isn't it? It's good. It's good. I like that there is that attention to detail. I'm now going to be looking at the feet now. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to have to reread and just look at the feet now and just see, are they wearing shoes? Are they indoors? Are they wearing shoes?
And just watch. I'll have forgotten one. But my whole thing is that, if Hark is with like the American cops as he's coming in, he doesn't take his shoes off. But if he's basically meeting his Asian character, the Chinese characters, like as equals, then he would take their shoes off and the thing. So sometimes I think there's a scene where you will see him. I think in the scene with O'Malley in the first issue, he does have his shoes on, sort of in that scene, because he's with an American cop. But then later, I know in issue 3, and just watch, there'll be like a panel we forgot. But like in issue 3. With him and Lucy, we were just like, no, both of their shoes should be off. So like, let's make sure all their shoes are off in this issue.
That is excellent. Like, I am gonna have to go and look at that now again, which is, that's great. little things. But I think it's interesting because he is in between two worlds, and I like how he is interacting with the white cops differently to the Chinese community, but he's never comfortable doing either of them at points.
Yes, 100%. And I think, hopefully is one of the appeals of the character. And I also hope too that there's something that not just Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, but sort of any immigrant American or any / American can kind of relate to, in that of sort of being a product of both worlds. and trying to see what the Venn diagram that overlaps, that which is where you live, what that means and how far that extends on both ends.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to explore it through, you know, the cop who is also, he has this background and he had, you know, he had a weird upbringing, let's put it that way, didn't he?
Yeah. And again, it's hopefully just taking, you know, and this is what I love about genre, what genre does so well. It's taking things that are internal and externalizing them and heightening them to the point where you can kind of see there are details of it that you can see a little clearer, because everything is heightened and externalized, but hopefully not melodramatized.
Yeah, because it could go too far. It never does. It all feels very just, I'm going to say, I don't want to say normal drama, because that just sounds weird, but not melodrama. Yeah, not melodrama. Because that's, I mean, I find it interesting because it encompasses, there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot.
It's one of the things I pride us on, is like, I think that for money, you get about 50% more comic than your normal sort of comic. There's a lot of compressed storytelling in there. And it's done that primarily because I very much want to give you the sensation like you're reading a 30s pulp novel, but in comic book form. And so as a result, you know, there's a little bit more narration. The word count might be a little bit more than I would use in a regular comic, but you just want to give the illusion. And sort of for Infidel, since you read Infidel, the same way, and it's how I always sort of, the analogy I always use, the goal there was to make it look like you're watching a horror movie, but still very, you know, distinctly reading a comic. And so I wanted to take that with the pulp novel and sort of do that here.
It definitely is, because I raided my grandfather's pulp novels
Okay.
at one point. So I have read the odd one. He was into Mike Hammer. We won't go there.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So, and reading that, it does read perfectly like it does. It's just, you know, pulp novel in visual form. It definitely does that.
Cool.
And yeah, the way that it starts off with what you think is just a really simple case of a missing girl, and then it's really not.
Yeah.
You've got organized crime, you've got a serial killer, you've got corruption, you've got this, you've got all of this other stuff. I really like that it's that dense.
Cool. I'm glad.
It's got all that going on. Was that hard to sort of plot out, just having all those different balls? Because there's a lot of balls you've got to juggle.
Yeah. I actually, what I do is I have it's kind of sort of my baseline, and then what I like to do is when I get into the issues, sort of play with things a little bit. But I did have to like set up like a spreadsheet, and I was just like, okay, I throw this ball up in this issue, where do I catch it, and all those kind of things, and just trying to track and hopefully no thread goes, you know, and hopefully all the threads get tied back in eventually by the end of it. But it's my constant fear is like, maybe I missed one, or maybe I didn't tie it up well enough, and they're gonna feel, you know, dissatisfied with all this.
Yeah, because there's certain ones that are more interesting than others, but at the same time, I want to know how they all resolve. So
right, yeah.
It's like I really want to know what that one, but also that one and that one and that. Yeah. So I can imagine that was a very crowded spreadsheet. Yeah,
it was. It's one of the reasons why the book is as long as it is.
Yeah, because 10 issues, because it's almost like it's a mini series almost at 10 issues, whereas traditionally sort of, Infidel was 5, wasn't it?
That was 5, yes. It's twice of Infidel, yeah.
Yeah, but it needs to be.
Yeah, it does.
But just where I think I know where it's going, it just throws a complete curveball.
I hope that continues to be the case. We'll see.
But what I also like is that you sort of expand out into it's not you don't just have the focus on the single character, even though he is our point of view character. There's also, is it issue 3 where we have Lucy? Yeah. And we delve into her life a little bit and see. I really liked that. I really enjoyed that. Was that something you wanted to show a bit more of the community from somebody else's point of view? Yes,
absolutely. You know, Hark is a the perfect type character I thought to sort of explore Chinatown with, because he's these new eyes. But the problem I found from that is, from his outsiders, that there's so much he wasn't going to know about that world. And so it became interesting. It became important to me to introduce Lucy, who looks at the world from a completely different vantage point. She's a woman in sort of 1930s Chinatown, and she grew up there. That's really all she knows about the world. And so there was a certain detail about Chinatown at the time that I couldn't get to through Hark's eyes, and so Lucy became sort of paramount to exploring all of that.
Yeah, because she has a very different story, but I really like Lucy as a character.
Good.
Are we going to see more of Lucy? Please tell me yes.
Yes, we will see more of Lucy. Hopefully not in the way that you expect, but you will see more of Lucy. We are all on the team big fans of hers. So she's definitely one of those characters that were introduced and kind of took on a life of her own. That's
really good, because I think that's one of the other things is, like, with noir, women tend to play traditionally a certain role within that genre. You've got sort of the femme fatale, or you've got the woman who comes in distress, and it's nice to have a character who kind of doesn't fit into those boxes.
I'm glad. It's certainly what we're trying, certainly what we're going for. The noir is definitely guilty of sort of the Madonna whore sort of complex, and so part of writing any female characters in noir is, to a certain extent, it's not quite a noir if you don't have a femme fatale, but then you don't want to fall into the traps of that. So it specifically with your female characters, I feel in noir, you're walking a tightrope. And so, we'll see how I do by the end of in the book, but it was very aware that this is a tightrope. The biggest challenge, I think, in noir is writing your female characters, because, like, as you mentioned, the genre has a history of not treating them the way they deserve to be treated. And so when you're trying to do certainly what I'm trying to do, which is echo all the tropes and sort of modernize them and twist on them a little bit, the trap can be to end up doing end up committing the same mistakes that the original material did. Yeah,
well, you've certainly avoided that there.
Good, I'm glad.
Because there's other stuff as well. And I'm gonna sort of nearly get into spoilers.
Okay.
But we do have, let's say, a gay character. Shall we throw that out there?
Yes.
And that, again, obviously, 1930s Chinatown. It's not a great place for that.
No, it's not a great place for that. And I think it's part of, like, that's another thing that we sort of had to be sort of very careful with. And honestly, like, I'm fascinated by, a better scholar of queer literature and queer cinema and crime novels can talk more about sort of the history of queer people sort of in noir and in crime, because there are queer characters in the Maltese Falcon, and you see more of that in the novels than you do in the film. But even in the film, it's alluded to. It's just not expanded upon. Like, they didn't do away with it entirely, from what I remember. And so again, it's a little bit of acknowledging that history, acknowledging those characters, portraying them with sensitivity. You never want to set the conversation back, but at the same time, you still want to be surprising. And so, it's funny when I think about the tight ropes of the book. That aspect is definitely one of them as well.
Yeah, it's because, like I say, there is the expectation of the genre and the period, but at the same time, it's a modern book.
Yeah,
because it's like we've mentioned before, it does directly show sort of things that are going on today. So you don't want to sort of sensationalize something. Yeah. You want to be quite sensitive to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so far it's working out well.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you.
So let's talk about serial killers.
Okay, let's talk about serial killers.
Let's talk about some serial killers, because there's some quite brutal murders in there.
Okay, I'm glad they work.
They're very brutal. Was that something? Did that sort of say, yeah, this guy's gonna have let's go into spoilers. An axe is involved at certain points.
Yes. An axe is involved. An axe is such quintessential sort of like a hatchet specifically is so specific. Chinatown enforcers were called hatchet men because they use sort of these hatchets and these axes. So that was, definitely something I wanted there. And also I think too, when you're doing sort of a contemporary noir, and I learned this trick from being a fan of Garth Ennis. And Garth, who is a fantastic horror writer of himself, is also a fantastic dramatic writer. And one of the things you'll see in a lot of his work, but specifically his war stories, is he'll use just a dash of horror at times. And it so effectively transcends the genre a little bit. It makes the genre feel a little bit more dangerous. These tropes, these moves sort of in war stories that you kind of expect to be there, they cut a little bit deeper when Garth does them, and it's because he's flexing a little bit of his horror muscles there just to make it cut a little closer to the bone. And I've always been a fan of how he does that, and really took it as educational. So coming from a horror experience in my last book as well, that was something that I sort of kept in mind. I was working that like just the right amount of dash. Like you can't, if you exaggerate it too much, then it turns into Batman. But just the right dash of flexing a horror muscle there can make the action and the crime so much more personal in a way. Like I was just talking to I was on this podcast and we had watched The Green Room for the podcast, which was a great movie and I love that movie. But one of the things the director sort of said was there's a certain amount of gore in that movie, and for him the reason why there's gore in that movie, because when you see that gore you understand why the characters are motivated to change so drastically from the people that they were. It was that sensation that seeing the same horror that they saw made it clear why they could turn from like punk rock teenagers to pretty much killers in the span of a half hour, because you see like, oh my god, this guy got his hand almost chopped off, and you feel it, and it works so well. And so there's a little bit of that too in my sort of just flexing a little horror there. It really helps motivate, like, this is how dangerous things are, this is how much further you have to go. It works. I like using little horror techniques here and there to help push the story forward,
because it definitely has that impact. Because I found that those deaths really sort of hit hard. It's almost like wait, what happened? It's like when you're watching a horror movie and then things are going along fine, and then suddenly someone gets speared with something or gets their head cut off. Something drastic happens. And then, so when you're reading it and then this guy's coming along with his hatchet and then suddenly there's a murder. And I think it hits harder because of that horror element, partly because it's almost like you weren't expecting it, particularly with noir, where traditionally, it's guns and, alleyways and that kind of thing. And then to have this guy come into public areas at some point and just have that murder just gives it an impact that I don't think it would have if it was just a guy in a, even just wandering down a shadowy alley and then something happens.
Yeah. And then again, that's the, especially with the first issue, when they find the body, you are meant to see like, wow, this is an important death. This isn't, it's a character you don't know at all, but that everything has changed once, it's a white person dead in Chinatown. Everything is a lot more dangerous than it just being sort of a body there, but it's a character that you don't know. So, and you don't want that to hit on just an intellectual level. You want to hit that on a visceral, emotional level. So by dipping into just a little bit of horror there, you feel that, oh God, everything is different now. And because you're already feeling that, then you can unpack sort of like the intellectual and cognitive reasons why everything is different. But hopefully just emotionally, you realize, oh shit, everything is different now.
Yeah. Like, okay, that's really changed things.
Yeah.
I was not expecting that. Yeah, because there's a lot. Like, I was not expecting to see the sister crop up. I was like, oh, hello.
Good. I'm glad that we kept you guessing on that one. Hopefully, we will continue to do that.
I think I definitely think you will. Because the word development, I think throughout every single development, I've gone, I'm not sure I saw that coming, or I think I've got it figured out, and it's not the way I thought.
I'm glad. it is always a game to sort of try it as much as you can anyway. Try to keep one step ahead of your reader, and well, at the same time, again, not necessarily. Genre's a tricky thing. You want to stay ahead of your reader and subvert them, but you don't want it to come out of left field either. Otherwise, so they'll feel cheated. So it's doing those things that feel surprising, but when you look back, you realize like, oh, there is a trail of breadcrumbs. We might not have presented all of the trail to you, but there was enough there for there to be a trail to get you to the points where you're at.
Yeah, because it's interesting because like some of the stuff like about his mum. And the situation that he was in as a kid, that seems to crop up on several occasions in parallel to the fact that Ivy's gone missing, and
yes.
that's interesting.
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, is there? But yeah, no, it's just a very satisfying way to read a plot.
I'm very glad.
So let's so we've talked about the actual art. The coloring also really sets the tone.
Yeah, Lee Lowridge has been a friend for a really long time, and he's like one of the best colorists in the biz. I think all throughout comics you will hear stories of Lee like saving an editor's ass by just like doing something amazing in such a small amount of time and turning it around like lickety split. But he's so good, and I'm actually really proud. I actually think The Good Agent is one of Lee's best works. I think it ranks up there. My other favorite book that Lee's done is Deadly Class, and he kind of set the coloring style in Deadly Class. And I do think that his work on Good Agent ranks up there with his work on Deadly Class. I'm such a fan of Lee, not just his work, but also him as a person.
Yeah.
He's a barrel of fun if you get him. He's a madman, but it's so much fun.
Excellent. Yeah, because I think because comics are a very visual medium.
Yeah.
And so color is so important when comics not all comics have color. I tend to prefer when they have color, but that's personal preference. But yeah, it definitely helps as a reader when you have that good a color work, and it just helps guide you through. Yeah. And the letterer you've worked with on Infidel.
Yes, I did. We met on Infidel. I'm never letting him go ever since. And since Jeff Powell is a letterer, he's fantastic. He's got such a great design sense. I think actually Will Dennis, who has edited a ton of books, he gave his blessing that like the trade for the first volume of The Good Agent is one of the most beautiful trades he's sort of ever seen. And that's just like Jeff puts in 150% on everything that he does. And you see that in the lettering and you see that in the design work. And he's one of those people, and it's something I definitely respect a lot, where you don't necessarily see all the work he puts in on the page. And by that, I mean, he gives design a lot of thought. So things will be minimalist, but it will communicate things so well, it's on so many different levels, whether it's using different balloon shapes, and slightly different fonts, which I didn't even realize, but there's a slightly different font when the languages are different. Balloon shapes and different fonts to do that. The fact that one of the things I love is I love how big the lettering is, because I'm sadly getting older. And so when I read comics now, just the font seems to go smaller and smaller. And so I love that, and I also feel like too, I've always been a fan of that sort of John Workman style sort of balloons. And while our lettering isn't sort of Workman large, he has done this very nice thing in these very dense pages of having lettering that still feels like chunky, which I just love. I just love the way the lettering looks on the page.
I agree. It definitely, again, because there's so much happening and there's so much stuff about the characters and all the rest of it, it is important to have that lettering to sort of follow. And it does. It works really well. Yeah.
It's just great. Just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. So thinking about how timely this book is. Yeah. I mean, what fascinated me was even just in that first issue where you've got the cops doing what cops have been doing in the present day. Did you was that in your mind when you were writing it, or was that sort of something that came in later? You were like, oh, actually, this is really relevant right now, or was it something that sort of you had at the time and didn't realize that it was going to be, particularly with the police officers in that first issue?
It is a really good question. I think it's hard for me to remember. I think it was something that I knew was going to be relevant. I don't think I realized how relevant it was going to be. But I did think that certainly, police brutality, I'm trying to remember, but I think that was sort of part of my initial pitch of just like, it was going to be one of the things that was so reminiscent of sort of what it is today. And I have to say too that like for this book, I didn't want to be guilty of editorializing, so I tried to stick to sort of whatever precedent was. And so it was all the things I could find, either historically or what's happening now. But because of that, and because of the way this kind of stuff never hit this historical record, I am positive that everything you see in the book is a lot nicer than what actually happened sort of at the time.
Yeah.
There are just no records of that. But I have a hard time believing at a time where there were, 1930s, there was no such thing as Miranda rights, that the cops would be comparable today. They had to have been worse. But part of the rules I had sort of set for myself was if I couldn't find sort of a historical source for it, I wouldn't incorporate it. And so the violence is sort of very reminiscent today. And while it is depressing to show that nothing has changed, it does sort of feel like it must have been much, much worse. Like, the way I always looked at it, and if you actually look at, at the history at the time, the history of Chinatown will say that by the 1930s, the cops and Chinatown had a very good relationship. And this is where the book takes issue with that a little bit. Less than a generation of cops, I think only 30 years previous, they were taking axes to residences in Chinatown, looking to the doors of residents in Chinatown looking for the tongs. And so when I hear that, in less than 30 years later, some of those cops are now in a very good relationship, that to me feels like revisionist history. Like what we know now about police reform and how long it takes to actually reform police, there's no way it could have been all roses during that time. And so, but at the same time, though, I wanted to stick to what I could prove and what was in history. And so that's why sort of the police violence is there, looks like the way it does, because there's at least records of that. But I actually do think it was actually worse. And I'm waiting for the book to come out to talk about how naive my sort of depictions of the police at the time were, because I just wasn't able to find it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is history is written by the victors.
Yeah.
And this is a community that, like you said, there's no sources. It's just really difficult to extrapolate from not a lot of evidence. It's a shame, because like you say, odds are it was worse. Right,
exactly. And again, it is about sort of this community that was invisible at the time, like so many immigrant communities were and are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's really important, because like I say, I had absolutely no idea that there was all this going on. You just assume that, there's a Chinatown in San Francisco and everyone's coming in and it's all fine and good. And to actually go back and look at the history of it and go, wait a minute, they had like detention centers.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Suddenly in doing something like that, in drawing attention to the historical, it's also drawing attention to the modern day. And then you start to look at, like you say, communities in the modern day and go, actually, this is not a new thing.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully, it just reminds you of the concept of, there are certain communities that are in vogue about talking about sort of what happens to them, but there are a lot that aren't. And so hopefully it does sort of prime you to sort of think like, well, what's happening to this immigrant community that we don't talk about, and what's going on there? Yeah.
It's definitely, it gives you a lot of food for thought on a lot of different levels.
Yeah. Hopefully. Thank you.
Yeah, it does. Well, it does for me. I can't speak to everybody else who's read it, but hopefully,
I appreciate that.
Hopefully they're the same. I would hope so. So to wrap it up, you've got 4 issues done. Have you plotted out the whole 10 issue?
Yeah. I actually, as of a couple of weeks ago, I've now written all of the issues. and that stuff evolves sort of, art comes in and I'll rewrite stuff to sort of help sort of fit in the art and all and it's one of the great things about reading the releasing the book serialized is, the book has a lot of smart readers who offer, not necessarily offer, even though they do offer theories, but offer very intriguing insights. And occasionally I will read a review or read a comment that make me realize like, oh wow, I could probably go in a little deeper than I did. And hopefully the book is structured in such a way that, a lot of times, one of the things I find with story and plot, like if you set up the right moves, and this is what I love about comics, you can dig in a little deeper sort of in the lettering about nuances. And the book has a lot of smart readers. And so a lot of them have opened my eyes just like mentioning certain things and realize like, oh wow, there actually is an opportunity to go in a little deeper here that resonates with the themes of the book and all that stuff. And that's part of the fun, I think, of writing comics.
I really like that. The fact that even though it's sort of written, you can still react to the real-time conversation that readers have been having about certain aspects.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, and that was definitely something that, I picked up and learned in Infidel, because Infidel, it was an interesting thing. We were doing this book that talks about race at a time where the country and the world was having a very public discussion about race. And so it, the book was plotted out and the book was sort of drawn, but as the conversation was evolving, we could work to reflect that conversation a little bit more in the degrees that it paralleled what was happening in our story. And that is the case for The Good Asian as well. The thing I do sort of find exciting is that a lot of the themes of Asian American literature and Asian American film, they're still being defined sort of right now. It's still an ongoing conversation. And so this book, gets to be part of that conversation. It gets to react to that conversation. And so the conversation informs it, and hopefully at some point the book informs the conversation.
Yeah, which is really cool, because it gets all like one informs the other, and
yeah. So it does get to be a little bit of feedback loop that way.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
So 10 issues are done. So the first trade is out on September the 22nd in comic book stores, and September the 28th. Let's get that right, in the normal bookstores. Normal bookstores, not
exactly.
The line between the two gets blurry.
It gets blurry and blurrier. Yes, it gets blurry and blurry as time goes on.
So I can say it's a really, really good book. I'm looking forward to revisiting it in trade. I've read it in singles, but I am looking forward to sitting down and just devouring the trade in one go.
I appreciate it. One of the things I hope you see, like we hope that you'll be able to pick up different clues and different foreshadowings on a reread that you might not have noticed on the first read.
I'm excited to have a go at that, because I think it'll read a little bit differently in trade, because it's all there laid out. So I'll see how I go on that one. But cool. I am very much looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to the next 6 issues. There's no doubt I will be completely surprised by what happens.
I hope so.
And that's the best way to read a comic. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been really fun. I've enjoyed it. And can I just say, everyone, go and read The Good Asian. Go and get the trade. Yes. Thank you.